It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the CITP seminar, and our speaker today is Shaanan Cohney. Shaanan is a postdoctoral fellow at CITP, part of the CITP Fellows Program. His research involves the interplay between networking protocols and the law, with a particular focus on applications of cryptography. His methodology mixes reverse engineering and systems analysis with approaches from legal scholarship. He's won numerous awards for his research, and prior to his role at CITP, Shaanan served as a cybersecurity fellow in the office of the US Senator Ron Wyden, and as a technologist at the FTC Office of Policy Planning. So like many members of the CITP community, he has extensive academic experience and extensive experience trying to engage with policymakers on the problems of the day. Shaanan completed his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and starting January 2021, he'll be an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Melbourne. And so, in fact, Shaanan is joining us now from Australia, so it is the middle of the night for him, or the middle of the morning, I don't know, but it's our pleasure to welcome him here. Welcome, Shaanan. And so one note about the format, you can ask questions using the Q&A button box at the bottom of Zoom. Please type your questions as they arise. And if it's a question of clarification, I'll interrupt Shaanan and get that clarification. If it's a question that requires more introspection, we'll hold it for a minute until there are moments in the talk where he'll pause to collect up and take some questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Shaanan.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Took a second. Okay, thank you so much for that, Matt. We have a very short introduction.
Observe the security researcher in its natural habitat. Going along, examining threat models, taking cache traces, and in general, having a glorious time. It spots a wild vulnerability. What's this? A random number generator!
So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Now, if I can get the rest of my slides up. There we go. Okay, hopefully you are all seeing the first slide now. Today I'm going to be talking to you about random number generators and what they can tell us about threat models that we haven't considered before. Before we begin, I want to thank the 3 institutions that have helped make this possible: Princeton CITP, Penn Law, and Penn Engineering. And you can see a photo of the Distributed Systems Lab over there, and a list of all my wonderful co-authors who made this research possible. So our story today is going to follow a couple of different characters. The first of them is the National Bureau of Standards that later evolved into NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that oversees a lot of technical standards in the US. So these are a couple of pictures depicting the good old days of algorithm standardization. So Decree went throughout the land to find a good, secure algorithm. You can see Mr. Bureau of Standards saying, we need a good cipher. And along came DES, which was of an early cipher. The NSA had some input and showed the National Bureau of Standards how to make it better. They improved some of the design to make it stronger, and everything was great. So we have our 2 actors, the National Institute and the NSA, getting along great. This was all fine for a few decades. And then about a decade ago, the Snowden leaks brought to our attention that the NSA perhaps was not acting in as friendly a way as it was previously. In fact, they had been decrypting many different kinds of cryptographic protocols. In the words of the NSA, happy dance. In the other part of our narrative, meanwhile in cryptographer land, things are going a bit differently. The cryptographers are trying to come up with a good way to secure everything. Unbeknownst to them, with the NSA and other similar actors acting in the background, They're working hard on finding good ways to produce cryptographic keys. And the way they do this is through sources of randomness. Not all crypto systems need the randomness that the cryptographers are working hard to procure, but it's pretty important to a lot of their algorithms. Unfortunately for the cryptographers, true random number generators are very hard to come by. The sources produce not very many random numbers at a time, and are not really available in many consumer electronics until the last couple of years. So the cryptographers were hard at work, and John von Neumann had this one thing to warn the cryptographers with. Anyone who considers arithmetical methods of producing random digits is, of course, in a state of sin. However, without a true random number generator, the cryptographers didn't really have much of a choice. So they came up with notions of cryptographic pseudorandomness, where the aim is to get as close to the true random number generators as possible. The idea being that you're going to create an algorithm against which an adversary is not going to be able to tell if it's a true random number generator or if it's just this algorithm that's acting like one in a really convincing manner. The idea is to use computational procedures and algorithms to produce random looking data, such that an adversary can't tell that it's not really random in the true random sense. In order for this randomness to really work, you need a good source of entropy, a source of measurements to feed into the random number generator when it starts, in order that it becomes unpredictable and indistinguishable from true randomness. You need a good, secure random number generator that takes in this input and keeps track of some internal state, and from it produces cryptographic keys. And hopefully it's going to incorporate more and more entropy as time passes in order to ensure that the state does remain secure. The idea of my research is to study pseudo-random generators to try and figure out where's the mismatch between these two narratives, the NSA, who's able to decrypt all these cryptographic protocols, and the cryptographic community that has thought for a long time that it's designed some pretty good pseudo-random number generators that should be protecting our algorithms, protocols, and products. So I'll start off with a quick overview of the questions that I'm asking and the methodologies that I'm going to use to try and tackle this question. So my three questions are: number one, are the certified pseudo-random number generators in the real world actually secure? What impact did the standardization processes of these algorithms have on their security? And what does this tell us about the way that we have been modeling threats? Have we thought about all the different ways that things can go wrong? As you might guess, my answer to this third one is that there's a lot that we have yet to learn. In order to answer these questions, I'm going to take a two-pronged approach. The first is going to be much more technical, evaluating pseudo-random generators, finding gaps in formal models, reading documents that companies produce as part of government certification products, and then developing attacks by reverse engineering the products and algorithms. After that's done, and I've come up with a couple of case studies, I aim to use those to characterize the types of failures that happen in PRGs, and more than that, how the standards have failed, and then to generate a taxonomy of different attack types that could be used to compromise both pseudo-random number generators, but more broadly, different types of cryptographic algorithms. So let's start with the first part, standardized pseudo-random number generators. After this section, I'm going to pause at every major section break and ask for questions. So please hold your questions until then, or there will also be a question and answer period at the end. And submit your questions via text and they will be read out. So, standards and certification. There are a whole bunch of large variety of government programs with many different algorithms. Unfortunately, I'm going to force you to listen to at least a couple of them. The ones we're going to start off with are the Federal Information Processing Standards, or FIPS. And this is a set of publications and a set of standards that outline how government has to run its information security, and also when they do procurements, what products they're allowed to procure. If they want to procure a product, it has to match these standards. On top of that, there's the Cryptographic Module Validation Program, or CMVP, that I'm going to refer to a number of times. And this is a program by which a vendor can submit its product to a third-party testing lab. The third-party testing lab will check if they match the relevant FIPS standards, and then they submit this to NIST, who will issue them with a certificate that says that they have passed the program and are now able to serve federal government contracts with these products. The set of pseudo-random number generator standards is fairly broad. There are a whole bunch of them, starting with ones from early in the 80s all the way to the most modern standard, which was last updated in 2015. These FIPS pseudo-random number generators are incorporated into many products and many different libraries, as you might expect, given that the government sales is such a large market, and you don't want to miss out on this market, so you're probably going to, if you're a large enough vendor, meet these certification standards and use these FIPS certified designs. FIPS also specifies that if you're going to be certified, you have to use the approved designs for all system functions, and it can be the only source of randomness for cryptographic protocols to make sure that you're not generating keys from an unapproved other source. In order to understand how these pseudo-random number generators are being used in real products and real protocols, I'm going to present to you a cartoon version of a protocol. This is what it looks like when Alice wants to talk to Bob with using AES, a venerable and pretty good cipher with a key K. Great. Only thing is, it's missing key derivation. It's missing how they establish the secret. So we add a couple of lines in. They're going to do Diffie-Hellman key exchange in this sample. Don't worry if that doesn't mean too much to you. Beyond that, Alice and Bob are going to want to prove to each other who they are. So they're going to introduce digital signatures. This is all getting very complicated very quickly. And to make sure that an attacker can't replicate this communication over and over and perform a replay attack, we're also going to add in some random identifiers that are unique to this connection. All the things highlighted in red, one must generate using a secure pseudo-random number generator. If these things are not generated using a secure random number generator, this whole complicated construction that allows Alice and Bob to communicate securely falls down. Now that we know what a cartoon protocol looks like, it's time to start looking at our case study pseudo-random number generators. This is ANSI X9.31, one of the oldest standardized designs. This is what the design looks like. TI is a timestamp, RI is the output, and VI is the internal state of the pseudo-random number generator. In order to produce the output, the prior state and a timestamp are mixed together using AES. In order to produce the next state, that is mixed again through AES with a timestamp, and it produces the output. This design has been around as early as '85 in standards. And in 1998, John Kelsey and his co-authors discovered that if you know the key, you can actually recover the state. Now, this might not seem like a huge issue. However, if you ask any cryptographic engineer, they can tell you that if the key is fixed, then someone who is able to reverse engineer the design might be able to extract this key. Despite John Kelsey finding this flaw all the way in 1998, in 2004, a whole 6 years later, this design was still included in the next update of the FIPS standards. In fact, this design was only deprecated in 2011 and remained in certified uses up until 2016, when it was finally sunset. So this is the flaw that John Kelsey found. If you know the key K and you see the output RI, you could probably make a pretty good guess for the timestamp. And if you guess correctly, then you'll be able to recover VI. The reason is that all the procedures in this design are invertible. So if you have RI and you undo the XOR and you invert AES by using the decrypt function with the same key, you'll get back the state. what did the standard say about this potential problem? Not really much. It didn't really provide good guidance to implementers about how to use the key. All it said was, for AES 128-bit key, let star K be a 128-bit key. Well, that's great. That tells us a whole lot. This K star is reserved only for the generation of pseudo-random numbers. Okay, slightly more information, but still not enough to tell us that we need to protect this key or that we need to generate it in a dynamic fashion such that it's not the same for every version of the same product that's out in the field. The standard did not specify that this key should not be hard-coded. As you can imagine, this quickly led to trouble. Back to the CMVP that I mentioned before, FIPS 140 requires vendors to document key generation and storage in detail. So we searched the CMVP certificate policies, which are all public, to find if anyone documented the fact that they were hard-coding the key for ANSI X9.31. We found a whole bunch were vulnerable. 127 didn't provide us enough information to make a call out of approximately 300 vendors, but 12 had language that clearly indicated that they were doing things the wrong way. Language such as hard-coded, entered in factory, embedded in flash. We couldn't obtain most of these devices to actually check for ourselves and reverse engineer the software to see how bad things really were. One manufacturer that we contacted even lost access to the source code, so even they were unable to figure out what was going on. However, I was able to obtain a copy of Fortigate v4 and a device that I was then able to use to validate my findings. Reverse engineering the software, this is what I found. You'll see highlighted in red the 128-byte AES key, right there, hard-coded in the initialization function. What is this key? 6066B1F3. Let's turn to the NIST standards that specify how you test this. So F3B166, F3B166. Oh, it turns out that Fortigate was actually using the test vector key for their random number generator. They didn't even bother coming up with their own unique key. This allows us to undertake the attack that I showed in the cartoon version. We're going to attack the IPsec protocol, which is a really common VPN protocol, and we're going to use the raw PRG outputs to conduct a state recovery attack. The idea here is that we're going to use the random nonces RA and RB, which any attacker can see as it passes along the wire, to recover A and B that are used as part of the secret sharing. After the state is recovered from the random nonces, we'll then recover A and B. Fortigate hard-coded the NIST test vector key, which was really not a good move, which allowed us to brute force the timestamps that were required to undertake John Kelsey's attack with only 2 to the 25 work. Not very much at all for a modern computer. This took a matter of seconds on our cluster. We performed internet-wide scans and were able to do this against hosts in the wild, not just subjects in our test lab. And but you don't have to worry too much because the random number generator is not included in Fortigate v5. Phew, we're safe, and things are patched as a result of our disclosure. This was called the duck attack. We found on the internet 25,000 vulnerable hosts out of 29 million, and 14 million against which we were actually able to demonstrate the full VPN decryption. And kind of in a fun aside, we used fingerprints helpfully collected by the NSA to identify which devices were actually Fortigate devices. This was part of a separate link by the Equation group. The next case study is counter-DRBG, which is a more modern update to the ANSI X9.31 design. We still have a key K, but this time our internal state is just a counter, B. The way the design works is the counter is incremented each time under the key K to generate output. The user, or the implementer I should say, actually has the opportunity to provide additional entropy when they're building the design, which they can mix into the process. The design is part of a the design functions using a 3-stage process. In the first stage, the key is used to encrypt the counter and the additional entropy, and that is used to produce a new key K and a new counter. This process is similarly repeated just without the additional entropy. So you encrypt the key K, you encrypt the counter after you've incremented it by 1 under the key K, and this is used as the output. You do this process one more time, and that gives you the final state of the random number generator. You increment the counter, you incorporate the additional entropy, and you encrypt it all under the key K. Seems great. We've solved the problem of a hard-coded key. Not so great. First problem, the key isn't rotated until after encryptions are done, and the second problem is that the additional entropy is optional, so you don't really need to include it in order to still be compliant. Problem 1, key not rotated often enough. So imagine that instead of a reverse engineer, we now have an attacker who is able to side channel the key and compromise it at any given point in time. The attacker is then able to decrypt the PRG output because, as before, AES is invertible, and learn the counter. If they can brute force the additional entropy, which is filling a similar role to the timestamp in our prior attack, then they can calculate the updated state. If, as per the standard allows, the implementer chooses not to use add-in, well, this guess is pretty easy. You just guess that it's null, and you invert this process and recover the state. What does the standard say about this? Again, not very much. These sorts of side channel attacks are outside the scope of the standard. It doesn't mean that it ignored them altogether. Rather, they were just not part of the threat model or the compliance model of the standard. This also says that at some future point, mechanisms will be developed for tests and associated requirements, but that was not done all the way until this year. So again, once we have our theoretical attack model, we're going to find some real-world implementations against which to try it. We're going to find pseudo-random number generators with leaky implementations and magnify the leakage and using a side channel attack over many, many encryptions. Again, I reviewed a ton of these government compliance documents to find which ones were vulnerable, and couldn't find too many, but one I did find, Fortigate, version 5. Turns out the bump from version 4 and removing X9.31 wasn't quite enough. So I reverse engineered the code, and I simulated a few other products that I found also had problems in order to determine what kinds of implementation choices and what kinds of standardization choices would result in this problem. Among them were OpenSSL's FIPS module, which was the only way that you could use OpenSSL and still be FIPS compliant, NetBSD, and Fortigate. I used a pretty well-known side channel attack to do this and used some tricks to slow down my target and ended up with a success rate of 12%, not super high, but still viable, with a maximum attack time of 19 seconds to recover the state. However, remember that state recovery is insufficient. You need to also be able to guess the next output. To show that this was viable against a real-world target, this time I tried TLS instead of, which is the protocol that we use to connect securely to websites and other web endpoints rather than a VPN protocol like in the prior demo. The results this time were a little trickier. It turns out that this attack was not an excellent source for real-time decryption as for OpenSSL and NetBSD because it took about 30 minutes to run the whole attack. But for Fortigate, that didn't use any additional entropy, it was pretty much instantaneous, and our attack succeeded after about 2 to the 18 tries for all of the above. With this attack, we were able to recover long-term client ECDSA private keys, which were cryptographic keys that are used to identify a client who's connecting to a web server. The last case study that I want to show before getting to some takeaways is the dual EC random number generator. This one's pretty infamous. I'm not going to share all the technical details because it's been covered in great depth before, but this is a proposal from 2004, which was around the same time as counter-DRBG standardization. As early as 2006, while it was still in draft stage, there were already attacks out against it. However, once more, despite the attacks being published, it was made into a standard. In 2007, not only was a distinguishing attack found, which could tell you whether this random number generator was being used or whether it was a true random number generator, but Shumo and Ferguson demonstrated that the random number generator could actually be backdoored. This was a pretty damning finding, particularly for a standard that was for a random number generator that was already known to be on shaky ground. The design requires the specification of an elliptic curve and two parameters that are points on the curve. NIST had set this curve as P256 and defined particular values for P and Q. The attack of Shumo and Ferguson noted that if the person who standardized the design chose the 2 points P and Q such that they were a multiple of each other, there was actually an easy way to go from the S's that you see in this diagram, the R's that you see in this diagram, which are the outputs of the random number generator, to the S's, which are the state. In September 2013, the Snowden documents, which were leaked, showed that the NSA might have had a hand in the design and standardization of this algorithm. In fact, a project codenamed Bull Run had the explicit goal of influencing policy standards and specifications for commercial public key technologies. Julie C seemed like a pretty good fit for this kind of attack model. So in 2014, in response to this whole mess, NIST removed Julie C from the standard in disgrace. But then in 2015, which is when my work comes in, Juniper, one of the foremost vendors of network security products, announced that there were unauthorized code modifications in their code base, and it turns out they were using Julie C, which had been tampered with. As you can see in this Twitter feed, there was a backdoor that enabled full passive decryption of VPN traffic coming from Juniper's ScreenOS, along with a more standard remote admin backdoor. We did a comparison of the code from the patch, post-patch, and the code prior to the patch, and found that the problem that Juniper was addressing was that someone maliciously, according to their security bulletin, had gone in and changed the coordinates for these two parameters that are used to determine who has access to the backdoor. However, ScreenOS was certified for use with X9.31, not Julie C, so this was rather confusing. Where was Julie C coming into this whole process? Weren't they using ANSI X9.31 for their random number generators? We also suspected, Juniper also claimed that they would not have been vulnerable because they weren't using the NIST points. So even if the NIST points were backdoored, they had their own custom ones. However, even in congressional hearings, they couldn't answer how those points came into being, leading to a lot of open questions. So once more, we have our little fancy cryptographic diagram. We're going to use the random nonces to RA and RB to get GA and GB. And because ScreenOS gave us a lot of random output in the form of a 32-byte nonce, our attack was really efficient. And then after our state is recovered again, we obtain GA, GB. So the earliest version of ScreenOS that we could find did use ANSI X9.31 and only used short nonces, making this attack difficult. A later version in 2008 started using Julie C to provide input to ANSI X9.31. But there was a bug that meant that the Julie C output was exposed instead of the ANSI X9.31 output, and this happened every time. In the same patch, the nonce length was expanded. This means that as of the 2008 version, everything was in place needed to use the VPN backdoor. However, it was only in 2012 that Juniper claimed that the attacker got in and modified the binary to change the parameters. So this leaves open the question, who in 2008 had access to the relationship between the parameters, if there was one, and then who in 2012? When Juniper realized that there was a problem in 2012, their fix was just to go back to the 2008 version. And it was only after our work that they removed this bad random number generator entirely from the product line. So we demonstrated again a full passive decryption attack, and this was only possible because of both implementation flaws and standards flaws. So now something is really kind of tickling me. We've seen this process come over and over again where bad standards lead to flaws. I'm sure there is something we could learn here. So with a bunch of the attacks, some are passive, some are active, some have a flaw about keying advice in the standard, some of it's choice of parameters. There's something going wrong in a systematic fashion. And this is where I'll get to the last part of my talk. So if there are any questions at this point, I'll happily take before moving on. Nope. Okay. So this part of the work that I'll leave you with is about psychos. And to understand what a psycho is, we'll have to take you back to our storyline with our characters. In this case, Stan the altruistic standardizer who works at the National Institute of Standards and Time. He wants to build a secure, usable design, a great standard. But there are lots of people at the table. There's Jim from government who has a whole bunch of concerns, worried about child pornography, worried about terrorism, is a little shaky about how the encryption works, and might want to have some mechanism for gaining access to things. We have Dana, the developer, who wants it to be easy to use, doesn't really understand the cryptography, and wants it to be very easy and efficient for her to be able to build on. And then finally, we have Bob from business, who has his own concerns, wants it to be economically efficient, and wants certain business functions to be present in the cryptography. Everyone's got different motives. This is going to lead to a really challenging and probably long drawn out standardization process. And this could lead to some troubles, as we might see in a minute. So my big point here is that standards and certifications are targets, and they're targets that we haven't thought deeply enough about before. Our prior model was supply chain attacks, which are adversarial actions that are surreptitious, that attack the procurement ecosystem and the way we actually build products. And they're outside the control of the individual systems administrator. By the time the product gets to your door, there's a problem. This is a DARPA slide showing that they've thought pretty long and hard about supply chain attacks, which are maybe the contractor inserts something bad, maybe the subcontractor, maybe they insert something into the hardware. In fact, the government has thought very long and hard about this, as you can see from another leaked Snowden slide, where NSA operatives have intercepted devices in the mail, inserted electronic bugs into the devices, and then sent them back into the mail to their final destinations. So this is a well-known concept of the supply chain attack. However, the traditional supply chain attack that we're really familiar with only targets the implementation phase. It's when you actually build the product. It's already past the design, it's past the standards, the consultation's already happened, and now you're going into the mail and tampering with things. What I propose is that we think about pre-supply chain operations, which I term psychos, which incorporate a broader threat model that thinks about threats as coming in at all stages of the standardization, design, and certification process. These are adversarial actions that are still surreptitious, but that don't corrupt the actual product phase, but corrupt the design, standardization, and certification phases, and produce the problems that we saw, the types of problems that we saw in the 3 case studies. Now, I want to very clearly emphasize that I'm not saying that every one of these case studies was an example of a pre-supply chain operation. Rather, they illustrate how one might undertake a pre-supply chain operation. Having seen our 3 examples, it can build a little bit of a taxonomy of the different ways that one might conduct a pre-supply chain attack. The first is regulatory rollover. If you create a really complex regulation, you might be able to create fragility in the actual end product. Maybe you mandate that it has far too many features, and you know that when the features are actually implemented, it's going to lead to mistakes, things like that. You could include a direct design flaw, such as the one in Julie C. However, it could be subtle enough that it's not always detected. And then you can downplay it and just push it through the standards process. You could manipulate the parameters such that the design would otherwise be secure, but you shape the standardization process such that the ultimate parameters that are chosen are malicious and allow you to conduct attacks. This is often possible in mathematical cryptography, which relies on very precise and clever choices of parameters in order to avoid attacks. And the last thing that you could do, the last two things that you could do, you could make the system really complex, which is somewhat related to the regulatory attack, except that this is just done in the standard rather than imposed as a regulatory burden. Or you could ensure that certain classes of vulnerabilities are just not considered during the design process, much like what happened with side channel attacks in counter-DRVG's design. And this will open up new windows to attack. One can classify a whole bunch of failures from the past number of years in this way. I've included, along with the 3 random number generator attacks, a number of other attacks that have been the result of poor standards in recent years. If any of you want to ask me about the other 4 that I've included there, feel free. The key takeaway here is that not every standards flaw is a psycho, but also not every standards flaw is immune from suspicion, and it's something that we should definitely be thinking about and working to combat. These types of flaws might explain actually why the NSA went from having what cryptographers suspected were fairly low capabilities to having really broad capabilities that were evident in the Snowden leaks. There are really significant gaps between cryptographers' nice version of theory, where the math is provably secure, and the practice, which often involves government agencies, oversight, regulation, standardization, certification, and all kinds of practices which can lead to real flaws. Another thing to note is just because something is a standard doesn't actually mean it's secure. Certification is also not an audit. Just because your certificate is up on NIST's website doesn't mean that you're safe. You can, as we saw, certain vendors in fact certified that they were insecure. They said they had hard-coded parameters, and this was visible in their certificates. So the existence of a certificate itself is not enough to assure the security of a product. And finally, a lesson from Juniper: backdoors can be repurposed. The parameters can be switched. Just because you think a backdoor is Novus or nobody but us is no guarantee. NIST is working very hard to address some of the concerns that were pointed out in this work, particularly with the CMVP. They're moving to more automated testing that actually tests some of the technical details of the products and not just outsourcing certification to third-party labs who often do a compliance box ticking exercise. There's a move to automated testing. And finally, FIPS 143, which is the new version of this standard, is going to address some of the earlier attacks that were present in at least the models which excluded side channel attacks. Another thing to note before I leave you is that there's always a long tail of old implementations. Particularly, this is true in business and government deployments, which don't always update to the latest and greatest. So your new fancy protocol TLS 1.3, whatever it is, might be great, but it's always important to look back at old standards and see what we're missing. It's important to note that complexity and compatibility corrupt. We need to design our standards to be pretty simple. We have to design with developers in mind and with all these flaws in mind. And we have to build processes robust to actors that are trying to corrupt these processes. Where do I see this going in future? Well, there are a couple of different directions. We could try and find more backdoors in existing standards. We could do this by automating analysis of existing binaries, trying to do automated analysis of standards, trying to put more of them into formal proofs. We could try and immunize designs from being sabotaged. So there are a bunch of concepts in formal cryptography around immunization that gives you certain guarantees that even if someone has tampered with an algorithm, you might still be able to feel secure. And we should also be very interested in pursuing a line of research, or I'm interested in pursuing a line of research that looks at ways that we can make our standardization and governance more robust to help prevent these kinds of attacks or flaws in future. And with that, let me know if there's anything that I didn't cover that you'd like me to help you understand, or anything further that you're interested in. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much. Matt is still muted. Could get some help unmuting him.
Thank you. Thank you, Shaanan. So thank you for the talk. Thank you for the technical assistance. We have a question from Larry W. Could you point to actual design flaws in Simon and Spec?
Yeah, so this was one of the random number generators that, sorry, one of the algorithms that I didn't have time to discuss in depth here. Let me see if I can find the, oh, no, it is not in this slide deck. Let me stop the screen sharing. Simon and Spec were algorithms, lightweight algorithms that were part of the International Standards Organization standardization process. And Tomer Ashur and a couple of his co-authors actually presented at the International Standards Organization about some of their concerns. There were particular parameter choices that were made that were left unexplained in the design. They did not actually discover any attacks. However, they were very concerned that similar to the way that Julie C had parameter choices that were unexplained at the time, Simon and Spec had parameter choices that were similarly left insufficiently justified. The NSA did produce a justification document after the fact in response to community concerns, but many in the community were not satisfied with the explanation, and Simon and Spec ultimately failed the standardization process. Larry, if you want to discuss the details of the flaws offline, I'm happy to do that, but the technical details are probably beyond at least this talk. However, I'm not saying that they were definitely broken, just that there was reason enough to be suspicious and perhaps not to standardize them. Okay.
For others who have questions, please type the Q&A box and please put them in. I have a question, actually. I'm not a cryptographer at all, but it seemed like a major argument was that a new source of attacks is through these social mechanisms where there are multiple stakeholders and the governance process around them allows attacks. But you said it seemed like those kinds of things were hard to study using the methods that cryptographers know about already. I'm wondering where you think the kind of relative magnitude of those threats relative to threats that directly operate on the cryptographic systems. So is it the case that what you're showing is kind of like proof of concept, or are you saying like actually the bulk of the work is a threat is over here and we're looking over on this other side?
So this is where threat modeling gets to be really important. These aren't the threats that most people need to worry about when they turn on their computer in the morning, probably. These are the type of threats that when we're designing standards, which is a really important part of the job of a cryptographer, this is something that we really need to consider there. And building processes for people to engage in the standardization process such that people's voices are heard, and at the same time, it's also sufficiently robust against people interfering in the processes, which by their nature are very democratic, which also means they're quite open to manipulation. There is opportunity for a particularly intransigent individual to, for example, alienate others in the standardization process to prevent their voices from being heard, where that might improve the outcome. So when most cryptography in the real world, when it gets attacked, is going to be bypassed. And the question is it going to be bypassed with a supply chain attack or with an exploit that targets your local system, or is it going to be a problem with the actual scheme? The problems with the scheme, they're great if you're an intelligence agency or you're trying to do large-scale decryption. They're not the choice of tool you'd use if you were trying to target an individual, where a specific exploit might be more useful. So they're different parts of the work. They're both important, but you kind of consider them at different times. Oh, muted again. Could we unmute Matt?
that makes sense. Thank you. Other questions. Here comes a question from Andrew Appel. Is NIST still taking advice from NSA, or have they learned their lesson?
So I don't have all the internal details, but in conversations with NIST, they have undergone very serious reflection about what's gone wrong with past processes. They have definitely done internal reviews. Of course, in congressional hearings, neither NIST nor the NSA have actually said whether Julie C was in reality backdoored or whether it just looked really, really, really bad. However, even if it wasn't, and things probably point to it being backdoored, even if it wasn't, the fact that NIST came under such suspicion and its recommendations could not be trusted is a problem in itself that NIST recognizes now. And so they are working on ways to make sure that their processes are trustworthy and not just that the outcomes are trustworthy.
Other questions, please type them in the Q&A box. I have maybe a follow-up question based on what you just said. How would you define a process as trustworthy as opposed to an outcome?
Oh, I'm going to have to punt somewhat on that one and leave it to future work, but there is a lot from outside computer science about governance theory and about how to build governance that's both democratic and also functional. I think there's less work about governance in adversarial models, and that's something that I'm actually interested in exploring in future work.
Okay, other questions from the audience, please type them into the Q&A box. I have another question then. It's about the relationship between the case study approach that you take and then the broader lessons that you draw. So in other research that uses case studies, there's a lot of attention to sampling, like how you pick the cases can affect the kinds of conclusions that you draw. And so I'm wondering how you pick these cases and the relationship you think there might be to how that led to the conclusions that you drew.
So there were a couple of things which I think made that forced some of my choices. The other studies that I had briefly in the table were the other options, and some of which was my own research and some of which was other people. I chose to try and focus on one particular type of cryptographic primitive because that would provide the best grounds for comparison. So rather than looking at Simon and Speck, which are lightweight ciphers, looking at random number generators meant that I could try and find consistent patterns and also follow the history of development of a particular standard that went together. All the random number generators followed were either present in one standard or in a successor standard or in the successor. If I were to start looking at the lightweight ciphers, I'd be looking at other organizations or at other kinds of chains of documents. And so this allowed me to trace the development of the particular standards. And this, I felt, allowed me to best evaluate the process rather than just by drawing like cherry picking examples. However, I think given that this is trying to design a theoretical model for what might be possible rather than trying to explain examples of the outcome of my research wasn't to definitively say that this particular thing was a psycho, that particular thing wasn't a psycho. And as a result, I think the building a taxonomy from cherry-picked examples is slightly more legitimate than it might be otherwise. Even while I tried to adhere to a fairly regimented model of picking standards that all fit within the same organization and that fit the same process.
Cool. Are there other people have questions? You can type them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I'll get to continue to enjoy asking questions to Shaanan. So my hearing your answer there is that random number generators or pseudo-random number generators have a very specific property in that you can follow them over time and they they're involved in many of these different systems. Are there other things in cryptography that you could have picked that also have a similar kind of set of characteristics?
I mean, random number generators are particularly nice because they underlie a lot of the rest of cryptography. I think you could do the same if you were following a particular type of cipher. So if you were following like a particular sort of block cipher based on Feistel networks or something like that, something that had a clear chain of development. The challenge there is that we don't know of that many examples of failed block ciphers, at least that have made it into standards. Oh, and there's another question coming in.
Okay. Another question from Andrew Appel. At the very beginning of your talk, you had praise for DES, but isn't it widely believed that NSA deliberately weakened DES?
So that is true. NSA has always had a somewhat mixed reputation. The particular incident that Andrew, I think, is referring to, not as solid on this, was they, when DES was made into a standard after it was originally designed as a cipher called, I think, Lucifer, NSA requested that the key length be reduced to the point where they were able to crack it. So that was NSA's bad move with DES. And their good move with DES was improving the S boxes to which were certain parameter choices within DES that helped protect against differential cryptanalysis, which is a cryptanalytic technique that was not actually known at the time. So in one way they hurt and in one way they helped. Bit of a mixed bag.
So Andrew has a trivia question now. Where do NSA's theoretical cryptographers live and work?
Princeton, New Jersey. I'm not sure the answer to that
I'm
one.
not sure, Andrew. We're all waiting for the answer. Right, Princeton, New Jersey. That's very interesting. Okay. There's another question coming in also from Cart. Is there work being done to make sources of true apparent randomness accessible so that we don't have to rely on PRG?
Yeah, look, there are a whole bunch of different sources of randomness now. Modern CPUs, they're not true random number generators in many, but they have built-in counter DRBG that's harder to side channel. There are also oscillator circuits that you can get. There are quantum decay little devices that you can plug in. So they are available, but even if you have these, you'd probably want a pseudo-random number generator to whiten the output and even the distribution so that if your input source is random but biased, you might still end up with trouble. So we're always going to have this problem of needing PRGs. They also help to reduce trust in individual components. Like maybe there's a problem with your super quantum true random number generator. As long as you run it through a good pseudo-random generator, you have a little more security that the resulting output will be hard to break, or to predict, I should say.
Okay, other questions? You can type them in the Q&A box. I had another question actually about the case selection. So it seems like if I understand right, your case selection, you thought about different approaches to the cryptographic kind of objects, and you didn't, sounds like you didn't say, I want to study a domain, like I want to study medical devices or TVs or VPN or something like that. Is that a different way that you could have selected cases? And
I don't think that makes as much sense, because that's the type of attack, that's the type of model that fits more in like a supply chain attack rather than a pre-supply chain attack.
Okay.
Because the goal of a pre-supply chain attack is to create an algorithm that'll be integrated into lots of different types of things, such that whenever it's out there in the wild, you'll be able to target whatever it happens to be.
Okay.
The broader, the better.
Okay, there's one question from Andrew Appel that I can answer quickly. about my background wall, and that is a total coincidence. So patterns and randomness. And on to the question from Betsy. The question is, not a cryptographer, but would chaining multiple PRGs help mitigate risks?
That was the idea behind the Juniper's Julie C attempt, where they had Julie C feeding into X9.31. In theory, it can help. You have to balance that against introducing extra complexity into the system where things can go wrong. So yes, you're right that if random number generator 1 breaks and it's fed into random number generator 2, you have still some guarantee left over. It's still, you want to be careful about it. You're better having just one good design for the most part, or multiple good designs to choose from, but a single good design that you implement. There's also a really interesting comment from
yeah, we have
Peter
about
Rainey.
2 minutes left, so I think this will probably be the last question from Peter. And Shaanan, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this is something which I was actually unaware of, but I'll read it out for everyone on the stream, which Peter said his understanding is that the key length of DES was shortened to 56 bits because the extra length was not able to be captured by the original S boxes. So 56 was reducing the key length actually made sure that the NSA's S boxes would work. So that's a piece of information that I was unaware of that would potentially explain why, if they were strengthening it, they were also simultaneously reducing the key length.
Okay, well, I think that's all. Please join me again in thanking Shaanan for a wonderful talk and for joining us in the middle of the night or the middle of the morning. Thank you again. And for those of you who are interested, we have talks at CITP every Tuesday at this time, and you can check the CITP website for more information. So thank you, Shaanan, and goodbye, everyone.
Thanks so much.